in this country. Sovereignty hasn't been ceded, but there's a shift and a change, and I feel it. I can feel it. As co-chair of Reconciliation Victoria, there's a movement. More people are wanting to connect with our community and our cultures. More people are wanting to listen and understand. And I always talk about this cultural intelligence of non-Indigenous people, good, bad or otherwise, and then how that should be the vehicle and tool to use amongst your own and share the experiences and knowledge that we have in this country. Time immemorial, no story of migration, all stories of creation. We're taught your place, taught your responsibilities, taught about your relationships, and taught about your role and part. I see the shift in this country where we do have treaty, we do have truth telling, we do have voice on the table. We're a step further, but is it one step forward and two steps back, like the merry dance that we have in our communities, which has been thus far. But we all, I guess I've always lived in hope that people will understand who I am, where I come from, when they look at this beautiful, rich culture that defines me. The river flows from my veins. My heart's encased with clay, my grandmother taught me. It's an amazing narrative and story, and how we pass that pedagogy on as Aboriginal people. The ways in which we learn are not all the same. But today in this modern world, we have so many different ways of being able to pass that pedagogy on. And here we've got three beautiful examples of being able to record something, or somebody reads it and they get it, or it shifts them or changes them. Wominjeka, welcome to this evening. In the words of my great-grandfather's language, Alec McRae Briggs, the Wirrarung language, my connection to the Bunurong through the big family of the Yalaka-Willam mob, and also my Yora Yora connection with the Doolan Yagan and Yalupna Island clans. That's who I am. That's the blood that runs through my veins. So welcome to this evening, and I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome. Try that again. Wominjeka, welcome. We would love you all to learn that word. It is such a beautiful word, Wominjeka. Can you try saying it? Wominjeka. In fact, Uncle Shane, you're going to have to pronounce it better than me.
Wominjeka.
Wominjeka. I'm still learning myself. I would like to say that in the spirit of a new understanding of reconciliation, that we acknowledge the continuing custodians of this country. For us, where we're all now sitting, this is the peoples of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nations. And for all of you out there on Zoom land, so we're Zooming at the moment as well. We have a large crowd gathered with us across the country. And so please, if you can silently acknowledge the continuing custodians of the land of where you now sit. And I pay my deepest respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. And I really want to acknowledge the significant number of First Peoples here in this room today. It's extraordinary. And you just heard Uncle Shane say, people now are willing to listen and understand. So that's the journey that we're all on tonight together. So my name's Marg Hepworth. I'm the Executive Officer here at Initiatives of Change Australia. This is Sarah Narden. She is our trust building project manager, and she and Uncle Shane work very closely to create an extraordinary series of workshops and educational forums in truth telling and truth hearing. So tonight, we're actually, here for an extraordinary occasion because we have three incredible story weavers. This would be Tanya Rossi. Now, Tanya Rossi is Auntie Marge Tucker's great-granddaughter. And in fact, there's a number of Auntie Marge's family here tonight. which is so beautiful. So thank you, Tanya, for coming. Auntie Marge, and you heard Uncle Shane mention her, was an incredible First Nations activist. And her name now is becoming more and more well known, just as the history of this country is becoming better and better understood. And Tanya has a new and updated version of this book, If Everyone Cared, and she's going to share more about that with you in a moment. John Bond is the co-author of Sorry and Beyond, and we'll introduce John in more detail in a minute. And finally, Graham Cordner, who is the author of Find Our Heart at Mile Creek. And together you're going to hear a flow of the past and into the present and what the future can become if we're all prepared to step up and be part of that together. Together, these books embody the values of initiatives of change, right? So the idea, the four key values that we stand on and promote and help, you know, push out there into society, right? So if we look at honesty, these people have the courage and the commitment to be deeply honest, and they tell these stories through their books. If we look at purity of intent, they've written these books and they tell their stories not with any malice or not trying to, you know, stir things up, but with the purity of intent in their motivation to bring these stories out across society, right? And in fact, globally, and you'll hear this from John, the connection across the world and what Australia can bring to the world, right? Unselfishness, because they've all spent years and years and years, right, walking the path. And that you can, you know, that kind of commitment is extraordinary. This unselfishness and a service to others. And finally, love, because through all of these stories, as tough and as challenging as they are, comes this overriding sense of love of humanity and love of each other. So I'll leave those thoughts with you, and I'm going to hand over to Sarah. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Marg. I'm just going to get behind Get Up, Stand Up for NAIDOC Week, starting next week. So awakening our nation is a chunky challenge. A challenge because we are in two sleep cycles, a long sleep cycle and a short sleep cycle. And Graham Cordner actually describes in his book, go back to the first one, that we are in 60,000 years of dreaming and 240 years of nightmares, as he describes in his book that elders have said. Elders have also said that there are 240 years of cultural sleeping that's been happening. So there is some positivity also within that story that practices are sleeping. So during this 240 years, non-Indigenous Australians have benefited from, the colonial dream. And many are unprepared for a rude awakening. A dream built on exponential growth, obsession with land ownership, and unsustainable extraction of resources, and a dream premised on the great Australian silence of repressed Indigenous voice, unresolved treaty, and denial of truth. So the short sleep cycle is something that the globe is all awakening from, and that's the COVID hibernation. It's a reset of social values with the Black Lives Matter movement, awakening people around the globe, and it's coupled with a personal reset, questioning privilege and prioritising purpose. And Australia's political inaction around Indigenous injustice has gained international attention. Now with Prime Minister Albanese elevating the importance of the Uluru Statement in his acceptance speech, the floodgates have now opened and many Australians feel like polar bears awaking from a hibernation and plunging straight into icy waters. And they're overwhelmed by the lack of preparation, yet they're embracing and being enlivened by the experience of that icy water dip. And this quote really sums it up. Go on to that quote. Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. And that's a quote by Howard Thurman, an activist in the 1960s who would have, he influenced Martin Luther King, and he also influenced Auntie Marg Tucker. So a lot of this activism is demonstrated in these 3 books. And in particularly, I will now ask Uncle Shane to introduce Tanya, who will speak about her rendition of the book.
Yeah, Tom. Okay, thanks for that. Thanks, Mark and Sarah, for your words. I was just sitting there reflecting on my time growing up. I remember the days when on Sunday, Uncle Doug, Nichols had come past, picked Nan up, that off they'd go to church. Or during the week, they'd come, the car would pull in the driveway, and every now and then I was dragged along to sit to the meetings, to sit, shut up and listen. I guess there was that transfer, listen to the stories, beautiful stories of Uncle William Cooper on Malaga Mission, in the Scholar's Hut, in candlelight, learning in secret as we weren't allowed to learn to read and write from newspapers. And then what he did, I guess, for the Jewish community, the only man on the planet that stood up against Hitler. And, that's always been a part of my story. And then I guess I got that opportunity to follow in Uncle William's footsteps, where I connected with the Jewish community out on country, on camera. The only group I take to grave, and they do an amazing ceremony. So that's continuing that connection. Working for a department of Premier and Cabinet, I got the opportunity to go to Lake Tyers and work with the community there. And of course, through the histories and the stories that I learned, that Uncle Doug had gone down and marched and protested to stop the mission from being closed. Government had been in there 10 years, and I went down to fix all the paperwork up because they're under a shares model. The register needed to be updated so it can be handed back to community. So I guess, I'd follow in the footsteps of my elders. I came here to a gig, and once again, I'm following in the footsteps of my elders in being here in the presence with Auntie Marg, continuing that connection on her family. So tonight we've got an amazing opportunity to listen to some more narrative. Auntie Marg may be long gone, but she's still here. I want to invite Tanya Rossi to come up, and I'll let her tell her story about what's coming. Okay, Cass.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I don't think I need this. I think my voice is loud enough, to be honest. Thank you, Mark, for that. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Uncle Shane, for that beautiful acknowledgement. I also would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the lands on which we stand on tonight. I'd like to pay my respects to our ancestors, my ancestors, and our elders that have passed, and our present elders, and our emerging leaders, as you said, Uncle Shane. I'd also like to acknowledge tonight my mum as well, who's not with us anymore, who started this journey, hence is why I'm here, and also the wonderful Nan Tucker, my great-grandmother. It's a bit nerve-wracking being up here, but I'll do my best. And I just found out I have my auntie, my Nan Tucker's granddaughter, in the audience here as well. I have my family here who've never seen me speak before. And I found out I have my 2 older uncles online watching. So if I muck this up, I'm probably going to cop it. So there's a bit more added pressure onto me to do a talk tonight about this. So I'd also like to finish my acknowledgement with acknowledging other traditional owners that are here with us tonight, and that that are online, other elders and First Nations people that are with us tonight here and online. So it's quite ironic that I'm actually here tonight, because about 24 years ago, I was actually in another room over there with the Dr. Jennifer Jones back then, who was doing a thesis. And her thesis was on her own book about Black writers, white editors, which is, they were collaboration and compromise in Australian publishing history. So what she was working on was lots of Aboriginal stories put together of Aboriginal women, but had been heavily edited once it got to the publishers, and that for that era of time. So that was her talk and her thesis. And Nan Tucker, who to me, I'll call her Nan, to some will know her as Annie Marge, to some will know her as Nan, some will know her as Mum, they would have. So she was one of the people that were chosen that Dr. Jennifer Jones had actually spoken about on that evening. And my mum had told me to come down. She'd been invited to it, and my mum used to drag me pretty much everywhere. And we sat and we listened to Jennifer's story of how she had found Nan's written interpretation of her book, which wasn't a book from start to finish. It was actually just notes, handwritten notes, all put together over 200-300 pages. And she collected it, and she wrote little snippets of that dialogue and put it into her book. So she invited Mum down and some family. Mum came down and we watched this. And afterwards, she actually spoke to my mum and she said, Maxine, I'd really like to get Annie Marge's story and get it republished and her words put back into her book. And that's kind of where it started 24 years ago. So I remember her having a meeting with my mum, and they'd spoken about how they'll present it, how they'll go about it, who's going to write it up, who's going to read it all. So it went to and fro for a few years, but then circumstances intervened, and my mum got sick. She got diagnosed with cancer, and Dr. Jennifer Jones moved to New South Wales, to the University of Griffith, and so the communication was very few and far between. It ended up leading to my mum passing 7 years after finding out she had breast cancer, and it just lay dormant for a very long time. And then years later, there was a time in my life after Mum died that went really bleak, and I kind of lost myself and didn't know which direction I was taking, didn't know where I belonged, didn't know who I was connected to after losing my mum. So after a few rocky years, I was saying to my sister, who's in the audience tonight, I said to her, something's missing and I'm not happy and I don't know what it is. I just couldn't put my finger on it. So I was on a path of destruction really to myself. And then I had lots to drink one night, and I was sitting there looking at my mother's urn, and I'm just like, what am I supposed to be doing? What am I missing? What am I doing wrong? And it wasn't that night, because that'd be too cliche, but a few weeks later or so, I had a dream, and my mum came to me in my dream, and she brought my Nan Tucker with her. Now, they didn't say anything, and as quick as they came, they left. And I remember waking up in the morning and I got on the phone to my sister. I go, Ness, I know what it is. I said, after Mum died, I need to reconnect. I need to find this connection again. And I need to go back to community and my mob and figure out this story. There's something there that's missing. So within a month, I sort of tipped my whole life upside down, 360 on its head. I left the job that I had for 20 years, changed my whole routine. And I went to one of my daughter's school functions. And I met a lady who was saying, oh, there's a position coming up in the Aboriginal community in the western suburbs, you know, it might have your name on it. And within a month, I was back in working, and my story sort of started from there. So I bumped into Uncle Bobby Nichols a couple of years later, and he's like, oh, wow. He goes, you know, we haven't, you know, had this connection after your mum's gone, didn't know where to find you. Anyway, I became the pinpoint that he would contact me if anything ever came up about my Nan Tucker or my Nana Molly. So I created a family page so I could start putting it on and reconnecting the family again with all these functions. There was a mural going up, there was rooms being opened up, all in regards of my Nan. So we went along this travel, and I ended up being with a woman, Kimberly, who worked at the Bunjalaka, the museum there, and they were doing a talk and a little bit of a setup with some elders of the past, and Nan Tucker happened to be one, and they said, would you like to come in and do some videoing and talking from your Nan's book about her days at Kinnear. And I'm like, oh, sure, you know, I'll come in and do that. So when we were in the process of doing it, I went home one day, and I'm a very spiritual person, and I do believe in dreams, and I do believe in little things happen for a reason. And I opened up my cupboard door to have a look at my mum's, just to go through some of my mum's stuff that I hadn't looked at, and a photo fell down on the floor, face down, and I picked it up, and it was a photo of my Nan Tucker at the front of Kinnear's. So I'm like, okay, this is a sign, this is something. So I went and did this interview, and we did this talk, and then I met other people along the way. And one thing led to another, and it was just a particular day too. I had this, I was thinking about, I don't even know what it was I was thinking about, but something came up about this book, and I thought, I should get back on this for my mum and for my Nan Tucker story. So I remembered the name Jennifer, but that's all I had. And she did publish her book, Black Writers, White Editors, and she did send it to me. But unfortunately, I lent it to one of my mum's friends who also fell ill with breast cancer and passed. So I didn't have the book to refer to. So I have this is a bit of a funny story. I have this folder at home where I'd had many tattoos over the last 10, 15 years that I was going to get and was too scared. So I'd open up this folder, put it away, open it up, put it away. I'd done that many times over the years. And this particular day I opened it up because I went through that whole thing again. I might get a tattoo. And there was a piece of paper folded up in it. And I recall it because it had been there every time I'd open this folder. But this particular day, I thought something said, open it. And I opened it up, and that was the letter to my mum from Jennifer Jones. And I'm like, wow, there's another sign. So I happened to pick up the phone, dialed the number that was on there, and it was Jennifer. And she was really, really emotional. And she said to me, you know, Tanya, in the last couple of weeks, I've just been thinking about Annie Marge and your mum and whatever happened to this book. So that's where the story started. And that started about 12 years ago. So it's been a really long process, and it's only been in dribs and drabs. And so we started our journey from there, and we came here. We came here about 8 years ago. And we spoke with, Cheryl's here somewhere, and we were talking about, you know, who has the rights to the book, and are we able to get it back, and how we change it, and how we'd like to just put my Nan's words back into the book. So that's where it sort of began. And then me and Jennifer, she proceeded then to seek out her publishing, the work that she does with the publishers. And she spoke to some lawyers around the copyright and all that, and if we could actually do it, and what we're going to put back into the book, and who's going to write it, and all these questions. So over the last 12 years, like I said, we've only ever spoken once a year or twice a year. I received 18 months ago this. Now, it's not neat because this is relevant to what I'm going to talk about a little bit later on, not too later on, or these. So I received, this is all of my Nan's notes and all of her book, and it has been retyped. Dr. Jennifer Jones gave it to one of her students to read and type up. And they've put it with my Nan's words. So nothing in here is fabricated. It hasn't been dressed up to be fancy. It's just literally my Nan's words. And the reason for doing the talk tonight and about what it is with this new book is it's not really a new book. It's the untold story of my Nan, and it tells a lot more of the connections. All these little yellow notes you'll see here were all the bits that were taken out. Their connections of people, their connection to country, their names of country, their names of family that we were all tied to, that back in 1977, they weren't ready for the truth, or not even the truth, not so much the truth. It was unimportant to them. These were like, what's this? We don't know this, we don't know that. What's country? What's this? What's that? And they just took it all out and they put in what they thought would be better. So the way I describe this new book is that book, I'll take nothing away from that book because it's an absolute beautiful book and it should stay the way it is, but it is somebody telling her story to us. This book is her telling her story to us. And if you read this book, if you love that book, you will love this book more because it comes from her and it's her words. And it's literally, she used to always say this little thing. I remember as a kid, she'd say bah to things, whether, you know, if you took something or didn't take something, or she'd have a joke. And there's actually a sentence in here that recites that too. So they haven't dressed it up or broken it down to make it to what we all think it should be. And I took this book and I read half of it, and I actually went back on country. I went back to Wiradjuri country where she was born on the Murrumbidgee River at Darlington Point. And there's a reservation I was shown, and that was the reservation where she was probably born on the Murrumbidgee there, and it's all closed off now, and it will never be built on again. And they've just put a monument up in the last year during COVID with her name and her story and a few other people that were on that mission as well that come over from Warringezda. So I sat there and I finished off the book, and it was quite funny because I'd just been in Haynes. She recited a story here about how when they were little, they'd run along the river when the paddle steamers would come. They wouldn't even know that the little Aborigine kids would run along the river watching them, you know. And we happened to be there the day before that when I read that part of the book. But my journey is now is this is just a start. You know, there's been a lot of back and forth and a lot of talk, but it's important to bring this story alive today because I think we're ready for it today. And I think that it needs to be told today. And we're such a multicultural country that, you know, it's just awakened a new thing that everybody has a story, and there's so many stories and they have the same stories. And I think that this book, I would like to get it republished, and I would like to have 2 editions of the book, you know, and I'll talk with my uncles and I'll talk with my auntie. I do nothing without asking them first if I can do it, if this is how we want to go ahead with it. I'm just got the voice like my mum, just the gift of the gab. I'll just come out and talk about it, you know. My auntie's there real quiet going, don't point at me. But I feel I have to, and there's a kind of a reason, there's a little bit of a story behind this that didn't click to me until a few years ago. And that was when I was pregnant with my daughter. I remember my grandmother saying to me, you have to have a girl. And I said, why do I have to have a girl? I actually want a boy first. I was the eldest. And she said, no, you got to have a girl. You get it one day. And I never understood, never thought of it again. And then when I looked back, I was doing something. I was telling you today, I've forgotten now, but I was doing something, and it clicked to me that when I looked back at it, we had my Nana Teresa, whose firstborn girl was my Nan Taka. My Nan Taka only had the one, which was Nana Molly. My Nana Molly's firstborn daughter was my mum. My mum's firstborn was me. And then I had a girl. Went against everything I wanted, but I had a girl. And something clicked that maybe that is why this is just all coming down, because I felt the need, there's something that has to be done. And whether it's me who does it, whether it be one of my other cousins or somebody, I'm just going to start the path that we can get this out there and we can get this book done, because I would love to take this further, and I'd love to take it into the education system. And I think it'd be an amazing book for our young people to be reading, of any nationality. It doesn't have to be Aboriginal, but I think this will help support young Aboriginal people up and coming too, who want to tell their story. And there's 2 versions, and it covers everything. So my journey and my invitation here today was to talk to all the people that are in the room today, and talk to John and Graham, and maybe open up some doors for publishing, and somebody to mentor me on how the next steps go and what we need to do to get it out there. Because I feel that, like Uncle Shane said, something's awakening, and whether it's COVID and we've been laying dormant for a couple of years, but there's a movement, there's a change. And I think that this book would fit absolutely brilliantly in today's day. And I think it needs to be back in the education system for my children, for their children, and for the generations ahead, because it's getting harder and harder to actually be able to get your certificate or proof of Aboriginality anymore. So I think that it's important that we keep these stories alive, and we share them, and we hand them down, and we document everything we can for our future generations. You know, the stories of my uncles, my auntie, their stories, you know, we need to get it all down, and we need to pass it on. And I think that if I can get some grant funding and some publication, and we can go through it all, and we could have we will have, I'll manifest it, I've said it now, we will have an amazing book. And maybe it might be a journey that we all go on, and all the family chips in, and we all start talking about it, and we start having these talks, and we start getting out there, and we start delivering it. So that's my goal, is to, I can't tell you all, I can't give it to everybody because it's not published, but family has got it. I have sent it off to family, because I did send it to the uncles and aunties. I did send it to a couple of cousins of Nan's, you know, that grew up with her, that I wanted them to have a look and make sure that nothing was in it that shouldn't be in it, because it needs to be done justice. So I will continue to talk about this until we get it published, for my mum, for my Nan Taka, for my uncles, for my auntie, for my cousins, for my kids, and they can continue the talk down the track. That's it. Thank you.
Really touching talk, and I think what amazing education system we will have when we are reading both books and we're comparing what the history was in 1977 compared to current day. So I think we're totally ready, and we're, as a community, getting behind you whatever way we can. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you John Bond, who actually helped sell 20,000 copies of If Everybody Cared back in the day, where he was part of Armagh community. And Auntie Marg was very much an activist in the space that was very well respected, and the elders have walked alongside her and really had almost 50 years of learning how to be allies, who are now teaching us how to be allies. So it's such an honour to have most of you sitting here today who spent a lot of time with Auntie Marg. Sorry and Beyond is actually like an instruction manual of how to empower others, and it walks through steps that lead us to a national apology. So John Bond served as a secretary of the National Sorry Day Committee, for which he received an Order of Australia Medal. He now lives in Oxford, where he continues to work for peace and justice as Secretary of Initiatives of Change International. And for over 10 years, John has campaigned for the Australian government to make an official apology to the stolen generations. And with a dedicated team, John mobilised the Sorry Day movement. And in year 2000, 250,000 people walked over the Sydney Harbour Bridge for a stolen generation apology. So Sorry and Beyond traces the journey that led up to that movement, and it really invites us all to be agents of change. It was published last year. John will correct me on a lot of these details, but please welcome him to the stage.
Well, it's great to be with you all. Thank you. Some of the people that I've worked with in the past, there's Melissa Brickell, there's Nicole, and others. So it's great to be here. And my wife, Mary, is over there. And so we're very happy to be here. And I pay my respects too to the continuing custodians of this land, the Woiwurrung and the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And yeah, we've been away for 4 years, thanks to COVID, but we're back, and I have a daughter in Mudgee, where we've been, another daughter in Alice Springs. So we've had great times with them all, and we're also having the chance to stay in Oxford as a result of the Prime Minister's Kevin Rudd's apology. A lot of money was put into Aboriginal education by the government and by other institutions, which meant that the scholarships were available for Aboriginal people to come to Oxford University. And about 6 or 7 have come each year, postgraduates, and they've all become friends of ours. And so one of the great delights in coming back to Australia is to meet some of them. And we met them in Canberra, we met them in Sydney, we'll meet more in Perth. So, I wrote this book with my co-author, Brian Butler. Some of you will know Brian, a man who has devoted himself ever since the age of 14, and he's now in his 80s, to bringing the story of the stolen generations to national attention and to caring for the victims of it. And he's a man I respect so deeply. And so when I felt that we needed to pay tribute to all the people who'd been part of the Sorry Day campaign, and I said to Brian, can we write a book together? And he responded straight away. And so we worked at it, me in Britain, him here, telephone calls 3 or 4 times a week, and put it all together. I have newspaper cuttings from the campaign, the 10 years. They must be about that high. There must be about 2,000 of them, because it really did hit the media in Australia. So this book tells the fascinating story of how up to 1 million Australians worked for 10 years, received massive media coverage, and changed political attitudes so greatly that the whole federal party Parliament united in a national apology for the removal policies. And the book has two forewords, one by Professor Mick Dodson, who writes, "This book is an invaluable contribution to the literature about the stolen generations," and one by Kevin Rudd, who says, "Sorry and Beyond tells important truths, but it also contains a message of hope. We can all be agents of change." So in the limited time that we have, I'm not going to tell you that story, because Professor Peter Reid, who's the Professor of Indigenous Affairs at Australian National University, describes the book as a ripping yarn, and I hope you'll read it yourselves. But instead, I want to focus on the impact of this apology internationally, because recently a teacher in Moscow read this book, and she was agonized about her country's attack on Ukraine. And she read Sorry and Beyond. And she wrote an article which is now circulating on Facebook in Russian and getting a lot of comment, saying what she wrote, what an impact the book had made on her. She writes, "It tells a heartbreaking story of the Australian nation groping their way towards reconciliation between white and Aboriginal society. One might think there is nothing in common between Russia's attack on Ukraine and the racist policies in Australia. But there are important similarities. Unprovoked cruelty towards innocent people based on a false sense of national superiority, a refusal to recognize the dignity of the nation against which violence is committed, concealment of the atrocities and those who committed them, and lies, endless, varied, ever-changing, and pervasive. I am only a teacher from Moscow, but I am deeply sorry for what my country is doing. Please forgive us. Now your tragedy has become my tragedy. I am helpless against the madness of the Russian military machine, but I pray with all my heart for your life, your courage, your staunchness, and your victory." So that touched me deeply, and I'm in touch with her constantly, and others, I must say, because I've made 9 visits to Ukraine in the last few years. But to return to 2008, when Rudd made the apology, an immediate impact was in the news media of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Rudd has said that he was really astonished by how widely it went in those countries. Countries whose media normally has little interest in Australia covered this apology intensively. Mary and I have a friend, a Malawian friend in the heart of Africa, and he wrote to us immediately how much it had been in their news, and he was thrilled to read it. People who have known colonial rule are intensely interested in a white government apologizing for cruelty towards the non-white people they ruled, because there is much that former colonial nations have yet to recognize about the injustice of colonial rule. And then 3 months later, the Canadian government apologized unanimously to its stolen generations, directly as a result of the Australian apology. And they have put $8 billion into compensation and healing, a lot more than Australia, to tell the truth. And then 2 years later came the recognition of the 130,000 British children who had been shipped to Australia and other British former dominions in the 1950s and 1960s, having been told they were orphans. People who gave us much support in the Sorry campaign, and we supported them. And in 2010, the British Prime Minister apologized to them, and so did the Australian Prime Minister, and both set up funds to reunite those who had been sent with their relatives in Britain. And then in 2013, the Australian Inquiry into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse was set up. And this partly resulted from the media coverage of the stories of the stolen generations, because it was quite clear so many had been sexually abused. And 2 weeks ago, Mary and I were in the home of a stolen generations woman, a woman who's died, that's Mary Hooker, wonderful woman, but who had been viciously abused as a child. And she took her story to the Royal Commission here, and the result was that her abuser was sentenced to 20 years in prison. And before she died, she felt, and she is a wonderfully forgiving woman, but she felt justice has to be done, and she felt it had been done. 2 years later, Britain held a similar inquiry. So it sort of follows on, and that's had an important impact. So all this is helping the harm done, help us recognize the harm done to vulnerable people in our societies. Racism is being challenged as never before. I was asked to give a seminar in Oxford University about Sorry Day as part of the campaign against racism. And now in Britain, slavery is on the national agenda. There's increasing recognition of the extent of the wealth Britain gained from slavery, and our institutions are opening up to it. One of our main newspapers, The Guardian, in March this year had a whole editorial. Sorrow and regret are not enough. Britain must finally pay reparations for slavery. So this is the struggle that Initiatives of Change is waging in the world. Are you wanting to stop? Is that right? And to which this centre is dedicated. The Labour politician, Kim Beazley Sr., often came to this centre, and I worked with him on his memoirs, which I, as you can imagine, strongly recommend. Father of the house. But he put Aboriginal land rights onto the Labour Party platform in the 1950s. And when he became Federal Minister for Education in the Whitlam government, he funded Aboriginal communities to teach their children in their own languages. And 23 different languages were then being taught as a result. And he said something really interesting. He said, the key to social advance is not power, but conscience. The drive for power kills the conscience, whereas social advance depends on making the conscience more sensitive. All social advance depends on drawing the line of human conduct higher. And that's really what the Sorry Day campaign worked for, to stir the conscience of Australia by telling the truth about the impact of the removal policies. And many campaigns attempt to bring change by blaming those that they see as wrongdoers and so pressure them to change. But this campaign started from one man who accepted blame. Sir Ronald Wilson was a Conservative High Court judge, and he said, after listening to the stories of 500 Aboriginal people, he said, I was a hard-boiled lawyer, well used to fighting battles in the courts, but this inquiry has changed me. And he said, if it can change me, it can change Australia. And when my colleague Andrew Lancaster and I in Canberra heard Sir Ron say that, we were determined to meet him, because we both work with Initiatives of Change, and that's the heart of our approach. Be the change you want to see in the world. If we want a world of honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love, as Marg talked about, accept those values in your own life. And for Kim Beazley, it started with him deciding, okay, the first step is for me to go to my wife and tell her the things that I'm ashamed of, that I wish she did not know, and that she did not know, and that rebuilt something in their marriage. And then he decided to go to a politician who he had told a lie to and tell the truth to him. And he became a politician. He was 23 years in the Australian Parliament, who was respected for his integrity, such that when he was going to make a speech, people of all parties came into the parliamentary chamber to hear him. They didn't have ways of hearing it outside at that time. Came in because they knew that he would speak with integrity and tell the truth. And that is what we need from politicians. Anyway, so the Sorry Day and the Journey of Healing campaigns had those values at their heart. And I regard it as one of the greatest privileges of my life to work with people who devoted themselves selflessly to making the story known and caring for its victims. Our patrons were Malcolm Fraser and Loic O'Donoghue, both of whom fought tirelessly. Malcolm was ostracized by his own Liberal Party for his stance, but he kept on. He would phone me and he would say, "You see that article in the paper? Can you draft a response to that?" And so get it to me within 24 hours. So I'd work at it and send it off to him, and he'd work on it. And a day or two later, it appear in the Age, you know, and he kept battling. It was great. And literature equally, in all kinds of ways. And there's another lesson I learned. We were determined to keep the stolen generations issues on the national agenda. And that meant organizing big events in places like the Great Hall of Parliament. And they were scary because you had hundreds of journalists there. And if we made a mistake, the Prime Minister, John Howard, was always ready to go on the radio and say, "I told you so, these are bad people." But we kept on. And so often we found that difficult problems were resolved. Unexpected people helped us. As a Christian, I've been taught that there is a force of love behind the universe. And so often, though we trembled when we thought of the risks, we found the support we needed. And that has reinforced my conviction that if I take on a challenging task out of a sense of calling, like we've just heard that you're taking on this book, I find strength and support in ways that I cannot explain, but which give me faith to dare to do what needs to be done, even if I feel it's beyond my capacity. So I'm now working with a Canadian First Nations leader, Louis Cardinal, and he led a global Indigenous dialogue for several years at the Initiatives of Change Center in Switzerland. And COVID has closed that center for the last 2 years, but it will open again next year. And Louis wants a new global Indigenous dialogue. And he writes, "At the past global Indigenous dialogues, many issues were articulated well, addressing historical grievances, social justice issues, equity, environmental protection, and so on. The focus was naming the pain, what went wrong, why it went wrong. Now," he says, "we need to gather together again with friends and allies and share examples of good on-the-ground actions. There are many non-Indigenous people who wish to become allies to make changes happen globally and within their nation. It's vital, therefore, to share and educate on how partnerships can be created and we move into action." And what he realizes is that if we are to meet the global challenges we face, Western approaches are in many cases not working. And Indigenous approaches and values are need to pervade the world's institutions. He himself has created a $6 million Indigenous center in the heart of his city, Edmonton, which is open to all, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, because he feels we've got to pass these values on. And it's now time, he feels, for Indigenous people to take leadership in the world and help their countries find the values and approaches which can deal with global warming, with environmental destruction and other massive threats. And this conference will take place in July 2023, and he wants Indigenous leaders from Australia to be fully part of it. And I've urged him to visit Australia, and he hopes to do so later this year. So I do hope that you can meet him, sit down, talk, because you will have many ideas. This is a time of hope with the advent of the new government and so much else. And I hope you will seize the opportunity. Thank you.
Goodness. Thank you so much, John, for that quite incredible speech, and for all the work that you do. And what we're hearing from both of our speakers so far is it's this longevity, it's the ability to stay the distance, right? It's the ability to keep going with all the challenges that you've faced. Uncle Shane always says to us, you know, when you learn something, there's no use in the learning if you don't pass it on. And so really what you're hearing tonight, we're hoping all of you will take it and pass it on. I think John has an ability to help us sit in our discomfort. It's not easy to hear everything you just spoke about. But we need to sit in that discomfort, and then somehow you manage to take us to a place of hope, right, and a sense of change, and bring us on a pathway where we can move forward. So I can't thank you enough. So we move to our third speaker for the evening. This is Graham Cordner, and Graham is a long-standing member of IFC. He is a man of great depth, both in thought and character. He's worked as a teacher in Japan, Zimbabwe, and Australia. He co-founded AIM, Australian Independence Movement for Political Integrity, and ran as a candidate. Now, I'm just going to repeat that phrase, political integrity. What a notion. Graham has been an active member of the Friends of Myall Creek. So this is, and only a couple of weeks ago, I journeyed with Graham and a small group of IFC people to the Myall Creek Memorial Massacre. Massacre Memorial. An extraordinary place to go and visit, because again, like what you're hearing here, you go there and you are overwhelmed. You're overwhelmed with this sadness for what took place at Myall Creek. And then somehow the people who come, the First Nations people who come, and they bring this incredible sense of forgiveness. Can you imagine the depths to which they go to bring that, right? And again, it shifts us and it allows us to move forward. So Graham, welcome. And we're all really wanting to hear about Myall Creek and your book. Thanks.
The sound has gone. Can't hear you, Graham.
Just trying to sort out the sound. The message has gone through, so hopefully they can fix their end. They're fixing it now, so hopefully sound will come through shortly.
So the people at home, can we all stand for a moment's silence to remember the blood in the ground and to remember the trauma that flowed on from that John and Tanya have just shared. Let's take a moment's silence. Lest we forget. we remember them. I know the Aboriginal people have never forgotten. It's we who have forgotten. We are the ones who need to remember. And yes, I've been on the Mile Creek Committee, National Committee now for 20 years. And I'm also aware the massacre history, I've got there till the 1940s. They're still happening, the Aboriginal deaths in custody. I might just say that up our way, I'm actually from Wallumetta country in Sydney, but I kind of refer to myself as now coming from up that way. Yeah, what was I going to say anyway? Oh yes, we don't use First Nations, we say Aboriginal people. So excuse me if that's what I'm familiar with, we say Aboriginal people. It's interesting that John mentioned Kim Beazley. I respected Kim immensely. And his story was quite a simple one. Can we have the next slide? You might recognise there, if you're familiar with IFC, that's the shape of the logo of IFC. But I put an interpretation onto that where we are now, we're at the left-hand side. Where we want to go is the right-hand side. And in our Western thinking, which is always very linear, we think the shortest distance between the 2 points is a straight line. But spiritually, that's not true. Spiritually, we have to do a journey. And on that journey around the logo, we find at the bottom, we're facing backwards. We're looking into our history. We're coming face to face with the truth. It's only when we pass through that we can have the hope of reaching the other side. And that applied Kim Beazley. John shared his story, but he reached that point at the bottom and he faced the truth, and he went to his wife and was honest with her. And Kim had the thought after that to teach a people not in their own language, is to treat them as a conquered people. And that's when he started the bilingual programs under the Whitlam government in the Northern Territory. And that's my story. I met IFC in India. I heard a lot of young people just standing up the front sharing simple things, you know, honesty with their parents or apologising. And story after story confronted me, and I realised I needed that. I needed what they had because I was desperate. Maybe we only ever reach that point when we're desperate. And nobody had to tell me. I knew exactly what I needed to do. And I remember standing, this was in India, and I remember standing at the letterbox with my letter of apology to different people. And will I or won't I? And then I put it in the box. And, you know, immediately I put it in the box. I can only say I felt like a spiritual sense of liberation. I felt I'd walked through a door. And I was frightened to go through it because I didn't know what was on the other side. It was scary. I was only 20. And I put it in the box. And then when I went through, I found there was a whole bigger world out there that I'd never seen. This world wasn't working. And when I was desperate, that's when I went through. I call it the door of humility. And then I discovered Aboriginal people. How interesting, similar to Kim. And back in Sydney, I studied in the country. Yes, I studied in the country, and somehow in an unguarded, I might say, unselfish moment, or rare, I volunteered to tutor some Aboriginal children. This was in the early 1970s. And as I went week by week and watched these young primary kids sitting there, I came from a very white world in Sydney. It was white. It was all white. And when I saw their faces, I thought, who are these people? Who are they? Where do they come from? What's their story? And I later met some of their families. This was in Armagh. They lived in terrible conditions. They were in camps outside, and it was just tin shelters. It was home. We were welcome. There was no thanks to the buildings. And I came back to Sydney, and it's like my eyes had been opened. And then I found my auntie was Aboriginal. Auntie by marriage. You know, she came to our house every week, you know, every weekend. And we never saw an Aboriginal person. We didn't recognise it. How can you see what's invisible to you? And but then the sad thing is, you know, Auntie Muriel, she didn't see it either. And I wonder what it does to your soul to morning after morning, seeing yourself in the mirror with the brown hair, dark eyes, dark skin, and denying who you were. Yeah. And then I met Ben and Sarah in La Perouse. Ben was a pastor down in La Perouse. His mother was Aboriginal, his father was Native American. And they loved me. I couldn't. And when Ben died, we worked together a bit in his community. And when Ben died, he thought he'd failed, but 1,000 people came for his funeral. And then when I saw Sarah later, she said to me, "Why haven't you been to visit?" And the penny dropped. Yeah, they loved me. Then I went to Mile Creek. Jane, who's in the audience out there in Zoom land, she dropped me just a random note. I relate to what Tanya was sharing about unexpected things happening. And I went to Mile Creek. I didn't know why I was there. I was out of my comfort zone. And as one member of our committee, Kelvin, says, nobody comes to Mile Creek by accident. And it does seem as if I'm walking a script that was written for me from before the world began. This was something I was meant to do. Can I have the next slide? What I found out with, can you go back one? What I found out with Mile Creek was my journey is also my national journey. They're inseparable. And we're down here, unfinished nationhood. And we want to go up here to the healed nationhood. There's only one path to walk. We have to do the journey. I have the next one. This is Mile Creek. This is actually a sketch of the Mile Creek massacre. And you can see the gang that rode in, and they tied the hands like this, and then they ran a rope through, and they took them away to a gully. I won't go right through all the detail of that. It's actually, some of this is in my book. But Mile Creek stands out in our stories about massacres. Often Mile Creek comes up in New South Wales, it's in the school curriculum. And you could say why? Why does it stand out? Well, number one was, it was the only time it was the only time out of, Professor Ryan has done the massacre map, but the dots on her map, if you look it up, Ryan massacre map will come up. She's got a limited number and she's up to about 500. But if you take away those limits, it would be over 1,000, you know, the number. Moore Creek was the only one that went to trial and there was conviction served on 7 men were hung. But the effect was that after Mile Creek, instead of massacring in that way, poisoning began. And so the poisoning then started spreading out up into the frontier wars as the colony spread out. It went up into Queensland and yeah, and also down into Tasmania as well. But Mile Creek also stands out because there were white men who did the right thing. And you can read their stories. And this is for us, non-Aboriginal people, we can be inspired in the story of Mile Creek by people who did the right thing. And it was a linking of lights. The governor down to the convict who refused, when the gang rode in, there were 2 convicts. One joined them and one didn't. And this one didn't give evidence. And from the governor down to this convict, the Attorney General, the police inspector, the property owner, the overseer, they all did the right thing. And I call it the linking of lights. The lights linked up. But it was the only time that it happened. But Mile Creek's also known for another thing. Oh, can you just do the next slide? Yeah. Mile Creek is also known for another thing, and that was in the year 2000. Something amazing happened. We had the memorial ready in the year 2000, and the descendants, Auntie Sue and Uncle Lyle, descendants of those few who escaped the massacre, they were up the front at the rock. And someone passed them word that the descendants of those who had carried out the massacre had come. And those people were incredibly nervous about how they would be received. And so Auntie Sue and Uncle Lyle, they called them out. And when they called them out, they embraced them. They just embraced them. And it was only later that in that embrace, it was an embrace of forgiveness. It was an embrace of welcome to country. And thinking about it later, I realised we've never belonged here. We non-Aboriginal people have never belonged here. We came and took the land, the blood went into the ground, and we've been wanderers on the surface of the land, but not related to the land. And we never belonged. And that's what I was looking for, belonging. And I realised then, that's how we belong here. In that embrace, that welcome to country, we are connected to country. There's no other way except through receiving that forgiveness. And I say in the book, that forgiveness for us is free. It's a gift. But it's not without cost. The cost, 60,000 years of dreaming, 240 years of nightmares. And can you imagine out of that place, offering unconditional forgiveness to the people who had caused that suffering? And I feel in Australia, as I noticed in South Africa, there's an unconscious guilt in Australia, a subterranean guilt that is beneath consciousness. and it's shackled us, and it's held us back as a nation. We are made for greatness, but we live in rags. That past has shackled us, and it sabotages our best intentions. Now, I would say that facing this past is, of course, difficult. I'm going to use a word that we don't like. There was a book written by a Jewish, interestingly, a Jewish professor, Australian, and he called it Australia's unthinkable genocide. Unthinkable genocide? Well, you must mean Germany or Rwanda, not here. And I have a quote here in my book from Albert Speer, the Nazi minister for armaments. And he said after the war, as the Nazi environment enveloped us, its evils grew invisible because we were part of them. As the massacre environment enveloped us, its evils grew invisible because we were part of them. If I was ignorant, I ensured my own ignorance. If I did not see, it's because I did not want to see. Tanya from Sydney is Jewish and IFC member there, and she came up last year to Mile Creek, and she told the story that she was walking with Auntie Lenore back from the Memorial Rock, and then Auntie Lenore found out she was Jewish, and then Tanya says, Auntie Lenore said to her, "Oh, my sister, you will understand." Genocide did happen here. We have to face that. We have three choices when faced with that. One is denial. I think one is a guilt where we try and do things to prove to ourselves that we're not like that. And the other one is to own the story as my own. This is where it becomes difficult. You know, when the gang rode in, you had these two convicts, Anderson and Kilmeister. Remember, these men were abused. They were convicts. The society they grew up in was brutal. And this gang rode in and said, join us or else. One joined them and one didn't. The man who didn't join them took a huge risk. He hid some kids, but the other man, whose name was Kilmeister, he joined the gang and murdered the children he'd been playing with for weeks before. The ultimate betrayal. And I asked myself, which one am I? Am I Kilmeister and Anderson? And I realised both of me. Both of me. There was a foreign correspondent thing of a guy prosecuting the mafia in Italy at risk of his life. He had bodyguards around him all the time, 24/7. And they said, why do you do this? He said, because it's right. He said, because I need to, this is something I need to do. And he said, but, hear me, if I was born in their family and not in the family I grew up with, I would have been one of the mafia bosses. And that's the reality we have to come to terms with. You know, there's a naivety that John Howard, I regret what happened. I believe he did. And then he said, but it's not connected to me. I'm not like that. And then soon after, you get the intervention. He's exactly like that. So the only thing that can protect me is the awareness. I become aware that I am like that. And in that awareness, when the situation presents to me, I can see it. I'm aware. And then I can choose not to do it. So it's only when we have that awareness. Otherwise, we're being naive. We repeat the history we disown. And the other great loss is we fail to see the good. You know, we fail to see, like in the Mile Creek story, when we face that, we can be inspired by those men who stood up and did the right thing. And we can move into greatness. We are made for greatness. And I've seen at Mile Creek, greatness emerging. I've seen white people change. And, you know, I've also seen Aboriginal people change. It blows them away to come and find that these non-Aboriginal people are there, are listening, are wanting to learn. That's transformational. And I think of Prasanti, who came up with Tanya, 26 years in Australia. She said, you know, this is the first time I felt Australia. How's that? At a massacre site. It's because of that journey she found belonging. And you know, it's true. This is a challenge, actually. All those non-British people, I'm British background, all the non-British people who have migrated here, if you are living in this country and you know this history, if you remain silent, you are part of the evil that we denied. Just because we are British and you may be from some other country in the world, this history becomes your history. This year at Mile Creek, unexpectedly, can you do the last slide? Oh, yes. Just coming back to, I'm glad I put this up. This owning of the massacres, you know, we didn't do it. John Howard, I didn't do it. This is what Paul Keating said in the Redfern speech. Now, I want you to notice there's a key word in that. I'll emphasize it. We took the traditional lands and smashed the traditional way of life. We brought the diseases, the alcohol. We committed the murders. We practiced discrimination and exclusion. We failed to ask, how would I feel if this were done to me? We failed to see that what we were doing degraded all of us. We. It's connected to me. This year at Mile Creek, unexpectedly, I found myself in the program to read out a bit. That's typical of me. I found out 20 minutes beforehand. And I was reading what I had to say, and I thought, it's not enough. So I went to our Aboriginal co-chair, Keith Munro, and I said, do you mind if I change it? So he trusted me. And it got to a point where it said something about, we're grateful for the Parliament of Australia that has said sorry for what's happened. So I read that out. I said, but the apology, stolen generation apology. And I said, but we haven't apologised for the massacres. Paul Keating was Prime Minister, but it didn't come from the Parliament. We've not yet, that is what we need to say in our apology. Paul's already scripted it for us, but we haven't apologised for the massacres. And because there are Aboriginal people present with us tonight and maybe on Zoom, I want to say what I say in this situation. And I want to say to you, and I remember at Mile Creek thinking about this, the ancestors were not far away, the ones who had gone. And Auntie Sue said their spirits are free. They're free. But I've sensed they're watching on. And I wanted to say, sorry for the killings. For when your blood went into the ground and cried out for justice. And this is to all the Aboriginal people here. And perhaps when the battle gets weary for you, remember there are non-Aboriginal people out there saying this. Sorry for our denial. Sorry for the ongoing nightmares we have inflicted. Forgive us.
Yeah, I just want to say an enormous thank you to you, Graham. Again, you know, incredibly difficult to hear that, incredibly difficult to talk about it, such courage to do so. I remember several years ago now, many years ago now, speaking to an audience and speaking about the stolen generations. It was at a time when this was emerging but not commonly spoken about, and I stood at a podium like this and someone at the back stood up and called me a liar. I was reading from the government's recent you know, findings and publication on bringing them home, but I was accused of being a liar. And I remember at the time how that it broke me. And I went home and I was just in a state of turmoil for quite some time. And then I realized that on one night in my life, I'd been called a liar. And it turned out, when you look at it, to sort of be in a twisted kind of way, a positive thing, to experience that and the impact that it had on me. And the realization that there were people, the first peoples of this country, who had been called liars, or what had happened had been denied. So now we find ourselves at a time of change, I think. And Graham talked about this country has an unconscious guilt. Still, we sit in this unconscious guilt. I think it's becoming more and more conscious. And I love your description of being aware. Once we're aware, we can face up to it and we can move on. Now, it is really important that if we are in a place of guilt or overwhelm or negativity, this might sound a bit strange after everything we've heard, we don't stay there for too long. Like, experience the guilt, experience the sadness, but shift to a place of hope. This is really important. When you're left in a place of guilt, you wallow, and there's apathy, and you build defenses, and you will keep denying. But if we can shift as a community, as a society, to a place of hope, and really this is what you're hearing, right? These people here have walked the journey so that we move forward, so that we come to a better place, right? So let's honor their journey and many, many, many others who've walked the journey with you all. And Uncle Shane here and other people sitting in this room, let's honor the journey by moving to a place where we can have a better future together. Yep.
A way forward within cultural intelligence that allyships and First Nation leaders work together. So we'll just play this and see if it whets your appetite.
Thank you. Whoop. So come on the journey of cultural intelligence immersion with us. Come on the journey of First Nations knowledge solutions. Right? These are things that will change not just our country, but as John spoke about, globally as well. And an invitation there, right, to join a global conference. So fantastic. I've got a little gift. This one is for John. It's got your name in it. This is Find Our Heart with love from Graham. This one is with love from John. And this one is with much love from John, and thank you all. We're going to say goodbye to the people in Zoom land. Thank you so much for, I'm looking at the computer, like that helps. Might look there. But thank you so much for joining us, and we'd love to hear more from you, right? As the weeks go by and these thoughts just sit with you, and let what comes come, and feed it back to us. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you all in Zoom land. We've got one lucky last thing to do for the people in this room who bought a raffle ticket. So we have, what, the gift here, right? Do you want